Hello again. How are we doing? I'm just having a cigarette. Yeah, thought another video. Where are we now? It's the middle of October already. I had some ideas for a various number of different videos, but I wanted to do a follow-up on the East and West video that I just posted maybe, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago maybe. To just follow up some strands from what I was talking about in that. So, and hopefully this one will be a shorter one. And I've got another couple of things planned, more on Ezra Pound and Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which I vaguely got into in the Pound video. I wanted to explore that more, just to get rid of some kind of knee-jerk prejudices that people tend to have, but I'll leave that until this afternoon, maybe do a couple of videos today. So what did I want to get into with this video? I don't know if I actually mentioned the phrase filial piety in my East and West video. I may not have done, because I was a bit tired and not very intellectually minded that day. But it kind of came back to me as I was thinking about what I'd done with the video, and I wanted to look into that today, because I think a problem with a lot of Westerners is that they have, you know, we have knee-jerk prejudices against things we don't like, but we also have kind of exoticisms about certain Eastern philosophies that tend to be assumed as good, and I want to kind of just criticize this notion of filial piety a little bit today. What I noticed, and I mentioned in that video about teaching for so long in South Korea and in Japan, but particularly South Korea, and I'm pretty much going to direct this notion of filial piety to South Korea for good or ill. Because it is a very different mindset that people have, and for the visiting Westerner, particularly if they are elderly, you do get a lot of automatic respect from people, and it's quite nice, because often in the West we're so individually centered that we don't have a kind of cultural automatic setting that says, aren't old people wonderful and to be respected. It's very much kind of a case by case and within the family, I guess. And I'm going to make an argument kind of in support of that today, because there are elements that, and I think this is another thing that I didn't really touch on, which I should have touched on in the East and West video, is that there are so many things we can learn from the East, and there's so many things they can learn from us. And it seems to be, on a year-by-year basis, if we look at the media, that we are each learning the shittiest parts of each other's continental culture, as it were, each continent's culture. If you were just to look and spend a couple of years in South Korea, you would probably be inclined to be quite cynical about the way South Korea has imbibed the West. Like I say, in a cursory way, it's a very negative picture. They seem to have grabbed hold of all of the shittiest elements of American pop culture and wholesale implanted it into their country. And it's very disappointing, really, and very, well, it can be annoying, particularly for somebody who's European and doesn't really culturally ascribe themselves to anything really American. And in the same way, we kind of have this self-help philosophy, which can, if it has a sheen of Taoism on it, and a sense of the spiritual without the spiritual necessarily being involved. Again, that helps to promote books, you know. It's got that sense of the Oriental about it. We kind of like that. Which side is more discriminating? I wouldn't be able to tell. I speak English, and I've been based in Europe for a while and grew up in Europe, so I know Europe. I still know Europe better than I would say I know South Korea or Japan or anything. So my sense of it is probably still more developed as we, you know, regard Eastern culture in the West. But if we look deeper, there are certain grounding philosophies in China and inevitably South Korea and other Eastern Asian countries. You know, we have these grounding philosophies that are supposed to be underpinning cultures still. And I've spent a lot of time in the past, you know, studying these books in translation, inevitably. You know, I picked up the names for these philosophers in Korean, and possibly I could recognize them in Japanese or something if people were talking about them, but I wouldn't be able to imbibe them in the original language. So that's kind of a warning. I'm only reading translations, really. That's where I'm getting my information from. And that's a problem, obviously. I mean, recently I've just picked up a translation of Lao Tzu, which is, I think, a lot more true to the original than, say, you know, the average bestsellers of Lao Tzu in English. Now, I might be wrong, it's all very subjective, but I think maybe as you get deeper and deeper into Taoism or Confucianism even, you might be able to point out some decent translations. I mean, the translator themselves has to understand deeply the philosophy of these Eastern mystics, philosophers, etc. And if they don't, then that's a problem. I was disappointed to look at the back of the newest Oxford World's Classics translation of what they called the Tao Te Ching, with the D's, you know, pronounced. And even from the blurb, I felt like they were introducing, you know, cultural prejudices that we have in the 21st century, you know, kind of proto-feminism, I can't remember what exactly it was, but I felt from reading the blurb that they weren't really accessing Lao Tzu here. They were imposing the mindset of the epoch onto that philosopher, and that's worrying. And I guess we all do it. If you're a translator and you're watching this, there's always a danger of doing that. But if you're a good translator, I would like to think, and I'm not really, I don't consider myself a serious translator. I've dabbled in it for websites and stuff like that. You've got to take these things fairly seriously and know the author very well in their own language before you start translating them. I guess that's kind of obvious, isn't it? But I noticed when I was attempting to do some translations from the Korean, and for example I went on the government website in Korea, they basically just want you, they have a list of books that they need translating by popular authors, and they'll fund you for that. If you go with a text that you're interested in, that you think Westerners should read, and you have your own ideas about what they should be reading and how you're going to go about translating, you probably won't get funding for that. And translators are, like, I would say, more important than authors possibly. So there's all that kind of complex going on. And as I said in the East and West video, the interesting difference between South Korea and Japan, for example, is that Japan throws English translations of its authors at the tourist wherever you go. Any good bookshop you go to, you will find decent translations of Japanese authors. You won't necessarily find that in South Korea, so it's a real problem. I mean, as much as I enjoyed speaking the Korean language and studying it to a elementary kind of degree, that's an issue. You know, cultural promotion is not happening for whatever reason in South Korea, or it's happening in a very shrunken and demoted way, you know, and it's all to do with the government's prerogatives. That's possibly a separate issue, but the point I'm getting at is that some of these grounding philosophies are not as good as we are told. I don't, for example, and this will probably be my main point in this video, I don't get much out of Confucius, which is to say, inevitably, that I don't get much from the way modern South Koreans have brought down, I don't mean brought down, you know, like physically, like the way they've inherited Confucius and the way they've read Confucius themselves over the last 50 years is very helpful. And then there's a problem of, is that the original Confucius that they are promoting, or is it their own imposition? So we've got the problem of foreigners translating and imposing their meanings, but then we've also got modern Asian cultures imposing their own prerogatives onto translations of ancient writers. So, you know, it's a complex problem. But I would say societally, the way that Korea has understood filial piety, whether it has understood Confucius at all is a question. Whether its modern authors have understood this man is an open question. What I will say, and this is all I can comment on, is the experience of reading Confucius and then comparing it to the values of that book as I understand them in translation, and then looking out on the cultural environment of South Korea and seeing the elements of that grounding philosophy at play in the world. Now, I'll get into some specifics, but not too many. As far as I understand it, we have 5-6 books of Confucius's writings. I haven't gone back and done any preparatory reading for this. I'm just improvising my thinking on it. The things that I've focused on and thought about more are what we call the Unwobbling Pivot, which is a small book, and I've read it in the translation of Ezra Pound. And we have it's called the Book of Songs, or the Confucian Anthology of Poetry, which is quite a massive manuscript. I think it's, in English, it's probably 300 and odd pages of poems come down from ancient times, supposedly collected by Confucius. We have other separate books about government, how to structure governments, good governments, and also ceremonial rites, cultural ceremonial rites from ancient China. And these writings I've read in Legg's translation, which is he was a Scottish author and translator living in China in the 19th century. Now, admittedly, I haven't read into his books as much as the more popular Unwobbling Pivot and the Confucian Anthology. But in those writings, you will find this emphasis on filial piety. So in some sense, this is not so much a criticism of somebody like Ezra Pound, because it seemed to me that he dug into possibly the better side of Confucius. And just by the way, Confucius is referred to as Kongja in Korean. So most people, if you get into discussions with Koreans and you mention the word Kongja, they'll know what you're talking about. Whether they have any reading behind them is a new question, I don't know. To my knowledge, everybody has some reading of it from their high school, or from their schooling. And that's, you know, dependent on how their teachers read Kongja. Most modern Koreans, to be quite honest, couldn't really get into even this amount of depth with Kongja, because their prerogatives are pretty much our prerogatives, in the sense that they're busy trying to get work, and philosophy, the study of philosophy, is not the biggest thing on their list, as usual. But I want to focus on the philosophy of filial piety, because I think it's important. I've always, as much as I've differed in my opinions with my family, I always feel that I've had a Western version of what filial piety might be. Attempts to respect one's parents and older people in a community, particularly on a bare bones kind of physical level, the physical well-being of older people. But it's highly subjective, and as we know, we don't necessarily we're not on an automatic pilot with elderly people if we don't really have much in common with them, and we differ often dramatically in our opinions, very often politically. I think the gap has kind of widened this year, to be quite honest, with all of this virus malarkey as well, because the media is obviously playing on elder people's sense of mortality and all the rest of it, but that's stuff for another video. But anyway, the point is that we get on as best we can with people who are older than us, and let's say for me, I'm in my early 40s, so I would be talking to my parents, and they're in their, well, 60s, 70s, let's just say 60s, 70s, parents, that generation, older friends of parents, etc., etc. But it's highly subjective and individual, and we're not going to give credence to somebody if we don't have much respect for them as individuals. Now that is very different. Whether the modern Korean has read Kongja or not is nothing to do with what I'm going to say. If you, I'll give you a good example. I'm going to do another video on this as well, but just for brevity's sake, I worked as a journalist, very, very short time, didn't enjoy it. I'll get into that in another video. And as a result, I was mixing with Koreans of every age group, from late teens, early 20s, all the way up to, you know, the guy who had been translating into English and was the father of the manager of the department I was in, who was in his 80s. Now, in Korea, this man, smart or otherwise, is kind of like the god of the dinner table. So, for example, if you socialize with somebody, not in this setting, but in any setting, and you have somebody who's in their 70s at the table, everything is deferred to that person. There is no sense that the guy's there, maybe he's paying for the meal, maybe he's not, and he's going to sit and have a bit of a chat, eat his meal, and listen to what the youngsters are gabbling on about. That's very much not the way. He would be the centre of attention. All focus would be on him and his opinions, I'm using him because I think a female person of that age group would not have as much attention. I mean, I mentioned it in the East and West video. It's definitely super patriarchal, South Korea. So I'm really focusing on, I guess I am bringing gender into it a little bit. This person would have all the attention on him. All his opinions would not be contested very highly. It would be a jovial, supposedly jovial atmosphere. People would listen very carefully to what he had to say about the world, and you know, in this context, say of a dinner, you would basically assume that this guy knew everything about what was going on, and say the other 4 or 5 people at the table, perhaps regardless of whether they studied or knew more or knew less, and it's all subjective in the end of the day. But it would be quite obvious just from the way that they carried themselves in a discussion, and you wouldn't need to know too much of the Korean language to see this at play. That person would command ultimate respect. And I always thought this is fascinating, and also it's something quite off-putting for some foreigners. I think I'm fairly patient and probably dealt with these kinds of scenarios. They didn't happen often to me, but fairly regularly. And of course, you're working in a university or something like that, this is going to happen too. So it's in a business environment, in an educational environment, you get this stuff going on. It's fascinating, and some foreigners would not tolerate that very much, or they just turn up, eat the meal, don't talk very much, and get the thing out the way. And that was kind of, you know, from talking to them and getting their viewpoint on it, that was the way they dealt with this, because it was a very different way of having a larger group at a table, and not much fun. And, you know, if you did commit a faux pas and actually question this person, perhaps they spoke more English or you had a certain amount of Korean, this would really, it would create some tensions at the table, and you wouldn't necessarily be aware of it, because you would be treating that elder person as you would do at home. So you can have some back and forth. If they're wrong about something, you could contest it. You have a general respect for them, but you want to push the discussion, you know, in a way whereby you can get some of your views across and they can get some of their views across, and that's kind of, it's a push and pull, but it's not an ultimate deference to the opinions of somebody older than you, particularly say somebody 20, 30 years older than you. So you can kind of commit quite large cultural faux pas if you do push that, you know, particularly if somebody's making some statement that it's quite important to them, and it's baseless and perhaps idiotic from your perspective, because you would not be treated well by the other Koreans at the table who were younger and perhaps your age. You would perhaps gain more clarity about it in a smaller group or a chat with an individual afterwards, and that happens in the West as well. I mean, we all kind of know that once you get 5, 6, 7 people around the table, the insight and the penetrative discourse doesn't get too far. We've all had that, you know, kind of reticence in big groups. You know, you're not really going to get a decent conversation tonight, kind of thing, because there's too much ego at the table, and perhaps people who just have different interests than you and all the rest of it. I think that's a separate issue, though. The focus I'm kind of trying to get at is just the pure respect given to that person. And of course, you go back to Confucius, and there are a lot of tenets in Confucius that backs that up. And I want to be quite severe here. I really do think that filial piety is quite a destructive element of East Asian cultural life. There is the traditional side of me that says due respect given, but contested vocally in a vibrant atmosphere of people of different age groups. And I think that's the way we kind of deal with it. And in the best ways, when you have the best people at the table from all age groups, you all get some clarity from the generational differences. That's not what you get, generally speaking, say in a place like South Korea. What you get is, not always, there are obviously, I'm not basing my theories on statistics or anything, but in my experience what you get is a blanket agreement of whatever idiotic opinions you are faced with, in the form of a 70-year-old man, or perhaps somebody even older, who is utterly out of touch with what's going on and cannot really apply their feelings about life to anything that seems real to you about the way you live your life, say if you're in your 40s or 30s or even 20s. So great patience is exercised by the young, but it's not even a patience they're conscious of. This is the interesting thing about cultures, of course, is that modes of behaviour and modes of discourse are so embedded that even if you question them with somebody who's vaguely reflective, they may not even know that they're behaving in such a way. This is always, or at least sometimes, the fascinating thing about living in foreign countries, particularly countries that are very different to yours, is that just as you see these unconscious behaviour patterns playing themselves out in society, it gives you then the option to think, am I on automatic pilot actually when I'm in my own culture, and what could I do about that? Are there negatives, are there positives? And that's a useful thing. But I really think that filial piety, and the weird thing for me is that, you know, I do like the notion of tradition, and that there are some eternal truths and pan-generational truths that experience renders up in an individual that allows them a certain amount of respect to get to that position in life where you'll get that much attention just by virtue of having stayed on the planet for over 70 years. The funny thing about Asia is that for the Westerner, we know that it's, even though I believe early Christians knew about reincarnation, for example, it's really, reincarnation as a phenomenon is Eastern in our mind, you know, India and, you know, certainly in other belief systems in East Asia, it's there. The funny thing about reincarnation is that it injects a level of complexity into a problem like generational differences that we don't often consider. If we incarnate fairly randomly, it seems, and we already have a level of instinctual knowledge, or we approach experience in a very different way depending on the notion of how old the soul might be. And I'm not going to get into characterizing what the soul is, what it looks like, or any of those kinds of things. I'm more interested in how it plays a part in societal, socio-political interplay, discourse. So this is a weird contradiction, isn't it? That we have this automatic filial piety in lots of places in East Asia, but we don't, because that society is looking at the West and stressing the non-reincarnational aspect of Western cultures, they are exoticizing the non-reincarnational view of life. So they're not actually thinking about the way that they treat their elders in that way. If reincarnation is a much more random procedure, and that the average 19-year-old could be more wise than the average 90-year-old, that's not something that they're willing to talk about. And in fact, I think all of my talks, in one way or another, particularly these more improvised little speeches, That's kind of like, it's always going to be imbued with this sense of what the reincarnational is, because in the West, and say for example if you study social sciences in the West, which I unfortunately did when I was at sixth form college in the 90s, they talk about things like nature and nurture, right? The notion that you're born with certain things and then you learn certain things through experience. You see reincarnation already, if you think about it for long enough, it worries that kind of easy demarcation. Poets are born and not made. Reincarnation worries that demarcation, that easy demarcation, doesn't it? I mean, it only takes 5 to 10 minutes of real thought about that to know that if you have an old soul on your hands, they're going to deal with their experiences a hell of a lot differently than a naive young soul who's almost dead. And I mean, I'm severe on that one. I mean, most people, to me personally, are dead. I mean, they're not reflecting on their actions, and they're not changing their behaviors as a result of what experience is giving them. They're simply repeating cyclically a karmic pattern which is not very useful to them spiritually. And of course, then again, that assumes some level of hierarchy and I know more than others or whatever. I mean, there's a subjectivity to it. Maybe they are not dead and I'm simply focusing on certain interests of theirs that don't just don't figure into what interests me about life. That's always a danger, I understand that. And we can't put statistics on this too much. But the random fact of reincarnation, if we can study that more and more, immediately destroys the notion of filial piety, surely. Or if it doesn't destroy it, it disturbs it in a really impactful way. So, how do you deal with filial piety when wisdom is gained in such a complex way and experience is not always learned from? And then you have another problem on top of that. And this is an interesting thing that I often see, is that how to explain it? We're still stuck with this sense of somebody with a few letters after their name is worth respecting. That's the Western problem. That's the Western problem. They have the filial piety. We have the intellectual one-upmanship and the dependence on somebody who has studied these things officially within an institution as the person who needs to be spoken to. All of this is incredibly complex, and it would just be inane to assume either mode is vaguely useful to us. What is my ideal when I'm navigating all of these questions? My ideal actually is the self-taught man or woman. Somebody who has, from a great passion deep within themselves, read a lot or studied certain things a lot. Not because anyone told them to, not because there is any societal reward whatsoever. Simply because they love that thing. Science, religion, philosophy, whatever it might be, literature, even more practical issues, economics, business, relations, diplomacy, and this is kind of the invisible template that nobody talks about, and I think it is related to reincarnation again, which is that some people can do that stuff and some people can't, and in that way love leads, because love and passion of a subject or a certain discipline leads the way. And if you get involved in that, it's my assumption that you are an older soul. which makes life very tricky, because from one day to the next, particularly with all the social media environment of the last 10-20 years, people are throwing their supposed authority on an issue at you on a daily basis. Since the virus kind of kicked into the cultural awareness in February, I don't know how many people are now experts on the virus. Within a matter of months, they are arbiters of how this virus is conceived and how it should not be conceived. We look on such a small scale. This is the problem with social media, generally speaking. We look for wisdom on such a small scale. I mean, yes, reincarnation gives us the idea that perhaps we will have the genius at 15, you know, Arthur Rimbaud, or, you know, people who are just incredibly good at something very early. Even Beethoven, Mozart. Yes, that is the case, but I guess we're inexperienced and we can't render up degrees of reincarnational wisdom outside of materiality. So the self-made man or woman, the self-taught man or woman, is the nearest we can get to that, and we can make some connections between reincarnation and the degree of study that certain people who follow their passion, you know, what truths they can give us. So to throw filial piety over the thing and assume that is the best way to deal with it is wrong, because a lot of the societal markers for wisdom are mistaken. The nature of experience is complex and cannot be brought down to how many years you've been alive, and neither can it be brought down to how many years you have been in formal study on a subject. It seems to me that, say for example, if you've studied medicine for, how long is it? I mean, in the UK it's 7, 8, 9, people study medicine a long time. I'm going to broad brush that and say they are more brainwashed because they have studied for that long. I'm not going to give them any automatic respect for that. I have to hear it spoken. What do you know about this? Tell me. And if they can't get into specifics, and then if they deal with generalistic statements about, you know, very specific illnesses, they are not to be trusted, and they won't gain my trust very easily. So it's a complex issue, but the problem with Asia that they can learn from the West is that we don't necessarily throw ourselves over somebody who is 75 and assume that they know everything. The other danger with doing that, of course, is the over-worship of the elderly. They're also in a position, through their tiredness and their unwillingness to make genuine inquiry into the world, they're in that weakened position, possibly, unconsciously or otherwise. But if you over-respect them, they will have no reason to learn more about what's going on in the world, and even in very local matters. They'll become psychologically lazy. We all know those people of any generation that are given far too much respect, and as a result they don't inquire enough about what's going on. The politician is the classic example, which is kind of like, I mean, in all these talks I'm going to be saying, you know, they're the last. Culture is, you know, way further upstream than government is. Politicians are given a lot of respect by people, then they go to another place, and then they're surrounded by people who want to get to know them, and they like them instinctually, or supposedly instinctually, and then that flood of respect hems them in, and they can't learn about that new place that they've gone to, which they're supposedly supposed to make some international policy over, perhaps in the future. But they don't know those cultures. There's no way that they could know, because they are over respected. And in the same way with the generations, this is what happens with filial piety. It's also made complex by the kind of I mean, 21st century life is a lot more complex than, well, it's hard to pick certain epochs, but even 19th century life, to me, and from what I've studied and from reading people who lived at that time, it was probably much worse off in many ways, but it was simpler. You knew your place and you knew how to navigate your life, generally speaking, even if it was perhaps a horrific life compared to 21st century standards. It's very complex now. So the self-taught man or woman is the best template, I think, for navigating 21st century life. I don't think necessarily the elderly, in a blanket way, have the goods on the truth. And I mean, there's a lot of criticism, particularly if we get more specific into what's happened since World War II. There's a lot of people banging, you know, the boomers, and I probably have in one or two videos as well. You know, they're not interested in what's happened there, and that's more to do with the kind of revelatory quality of technological advancement and what information you're going to access, particularly in the last 10-15 years. We're all dealing with that, actually, at whatever level of advancement we're in, because it's vast. Can you imagine? So you go from the 1980s. In England, you had 3 to 4 television stations, and now if you take the station as template, or the channel, YouTube, more video distribution channels on the internet coming in the future pretty quickly, as far as I can see. So now you've gone from 4 channels to thousands of channels of information, and I'm one of them. And in many ways, it's very positive. I think it's a very freeing thing. So, as a result, and this is probably worth another video, but you're going to get some sense of social isolation, because as the person finds more information that is specific, much more specific to their interests than it would have been 20 years ago, they are flooded with that information, and of course they're not able to be as outgoing as they used to be, because they're happy in some sense, they're comfortable that that information suits them, and they can live with that on a day-to-day basis in a lot of an easier way. Whereas the pre-internet days assume that you're going to be around a bunch of people who don't think very similarly to you, but you'll tolerate them because you don't have your best friend and his wisdom in the form of he can't be your best friend ultimately, because he's just a person on a screen, you know, man or woman, whatever age group. You've got those people there in this 2020 scenario, in this 2020 cultural situation we're in. You would have had more tolerance for the person who wasn't really interested in the things you were necessarily, or very specifically, but your social options are limited in the sense that you live in a small town, or perhaps even a city, and you'll listen to them rattling on about something that you're not really interested in a much more invested way than you will now, possibly. I think that's pretty true. So that not only are we distanced from each other informationally within a generation, the generation between those generations, the distance seems even more so. Because as we incarnate into this reality, our spirit responds to certain kinds of information more than others. We make choices every day. You know, you click on a video, So you build up an informational sphere within your life, which is very different to somebody else who's living next door to you, possibly, because of all of the reincarnational stuff, or the whether you're an older or younger soul as well. So there's nothing materially you can tell. You can't tell if someone's an old soul or a young soul. Perhaps the way they carry themselves and the way they deal with experience seems more sophisticated in some. And if you were wanting to gain more knowledge from somebody physically in the world, you could perhaps do that and use your judgment. So there's two realms going on here. You've got the noumenal realm, the pre-birth realm, or the past life realm, in which these people are supposed to have built up a certain amount of wisdom, which is then brought back into reality in this life. And then you've got the bare facts of what is going on only within this reality, the material side, in which there are indications of how knowledgeable and how wise possibly somebody is. So each realm interrelates with the other one, made even more complicated by the fact that if you're an older soul, you're going to recognize the older soul, whereas if you're a younger soul, people are more fragmented anyway, because you're not looking, you're not as aware, essentially. So separation is inevitable. Separation, even before the internet, was inevitable for the younger soul, because it's a dog-eat-dog world, and you're not of an intellectual sophistication to deal with anything else, and you're not reflective enough about your own behavior or other people's behavior. I always find it funny that people who seem more sophisticated in their relationship with wisdom get frustrated about what the views of them are by little yappy dog type people who shout and scream about insignificant things. The older soul is reflective about other people's behavior and their own to a degree that they worry about that, whereas the younger soul doesn't. The shouty, screamy idiot isn't worried about that. So there's no need for somebody who is wiser and possibly reincarnated more and accrued more wisdom to worry about that, because that person isn't reflecting on their behavior anyway, or on yours very much, to a great degree. So the message there is, get on with what you're doing, say what you want to say, and don't give a toss about anyone else. I mean, wasn't it Shelley that said, I don't even want one reader? You know what I mean? It's not that you're intentionally shunning people, but you're just focused on what you're doing. And if you have the love of wisdom, if you're into the true philosophy, then you'll do that. And when I say philosophy, I'm just using it as a grounding for all kinds of things you can do. You could be a poet, you could be a shopkeeper if you want, or create the next great business or whatever. So there's all those issues behind this problem of filial piety. And I think that was one of the elements that really frustrates me about Asia, and particularly about South Korea. The defining factor of a lot of Asian life, and this is, very specific to South Korea as well, is how will you look in your father's eyes, particularly, as I've already said, in a patriarchal society. How will you be judged by the father and the mother, but particularly the father? If all of your decisions in life, the most secret personal things and the wider societal things, everything is conditioned by that question, how will I look by these people? You are not going to be in a position to do what you want. You may never even know what you want, because you know what they want more than you know what you want. And your life will be miserable as a result, and it will be willfully miserable as a result. And there's very little you can do about that. It doesn't strike me as surprising to find out that South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, if not the highest. And suicide, as we know in Japan, is fairly well known. I'll get into another video about that, about Mishima Yukio's suicide, because I wanted to do something on that, seppuku and all of these warrior type approaches, because that's interesting and I have mixed views about it. But do you know what I mean? That sense of function in the eyes of the elder is so primal in the life of the average South Korean that as a Westerner, unless you've spent years living around that kind of modus operandi, you will not understand the depths to which this is the great function in the Asian world, as it were. To the point where, and I already indicated this in my East and West video, it was, you know, the problem of the fact that you are teaching people who are, and again, this is, I mean, with young people in the education systems in the West, yes, they are not separate from their parents. Yes, they may well be studying things that they really, their parents want them to study in some basic way. Yes, that occurs, but the degree to which it occurs in somewhere like South Korea is much higher. You are almost looking, when you're looking at a 20-year-old girl or boy studying a subject in well, in my case it was studying English, but if you're looking at a student in that culture, you could almost be looking at the face of their parents. I mean, there's almost no identity. And we could say that would be true of the average 8 or 9-year-old in the West, possibly, because we are creations of our parents in a very high, you know, in a very compacted way. It's obvious, we can admit that much. Even a 15-year-old is pretty much coloured by his parents' views on most things, but not to the degree of the Asian. It could be that the Asian or the South Korean never really escapes, never really forges any separate identity from the identity of their parents. And I don't, you know, that's something that's different. We used to have this mantra as expats in South Korea, which was, it's not bad, it's just different. Which is very much a kind of neoliberal notion, you know, be accepting of everybody. Be accepting of your own prejudices sometimes. That's okay too. I don't think that's good. It's different, and it's also not good, because I have values. I have these values. Now, perhaps one day I will come to more clarity on them and I'll tweak them and change them or whatever, but for right now, I think that's wrong. I think it's bad when somebody is basically their parent, when they cannot make their own psychological and physical life independent of their parents. And I do think that's why the Western world is we are the great inventors or artists and all the rest of it, as I may have mentioned in the other video, because we have that psychological distance, regardless of what we're doing, whether it's, even if we're endeavouring to become politicians or something, or architects, or whatever it is. What is that? It's the individual. And, you know, I hate to keep, you know, I kind of echo Jordan Peterson sometimes. I talk about this. He's not the be all and end all, and I've said that too. But yeah, I think it is worth clarifying that the individual is sovereign in the West, and not the group. And in this case, for what I'm talking about today, you know, the elderly are a group in some sense, and their opinions are to be listened to politely and rejected vocally or otherwise, depending on the situation. And I'm happy with all that. And when I get to 70, I don't want to be an authority. I mean, that's another cliche, isn't it? But someone who is an authority on an issue is the first one to admit that they're not an authority on either that issue or any other issue in the world. D.H. Lawrence affirms that somewhere as well. So it's quite interesting. I don't want to have such self-reassurance that people can't say whatever they want to me. it's a tricky balance to get, because obviously there are idiots in the world that you don't really particularly want to interact with very much. But it is the Western way, and it's hard. You watch people who are alternate researchers and they have theories on this, that and the other that might seem a little bit crazy to the average individual who's not done as much study. But the freedom that one gets, that one is given, that one gives oneself by tolerating opinions that we don't like, is a great thing. But I'm suspicious of this knee-jerk response to the elderly. I'm suspicious of any group that says they've got the goods on something just because of the way they inhabit that group preference, or that group delusion, often it could be. I hope I'm a people person, which is another cliche, but it means that you just sit with somebody and you listen to them and figure out what they think, and try to get to know them. And then of course you're at liberty to not know people. It's all very great. But it's not comfortable when you sit at a table time after time and listen to somebody who doesn't know anything being listened to with such rapt attention. It's kind of irksome to me, and that means that I'm a Westerner. And the thing is that people need to travel more, in the sense that they need to know what they've got instinctually. You know, Westerners do not know what they've got. The way they manifest their behavior in public, in their cultures, is a genuine miracle, and it has evolved spiritually over time to be what it is. And it's a great thing. Often it's a great thing. And of course vast errors and mistakes are made by individuals all the time, but there are certain cultural modes that we can be proud of. And if we just think that oh right, we got here but we're just these colonials who killed thousands of people, I don't think that's the full picture. That's a very small element of a much bigger picture. As much as I'm not, you know, I have that kind of pseudo-pagan sensibility of, you know, a North Britisher. It's like, it's the Monty Python, right? What did the Romans ever do for us, kind of thing. I understand that other civilizations, despite idiocies and murder and pillage, also inhabit other territories in a certain way that can teach. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, ultimately none of it's a bad thing, because even the horrific things teach. They do create horrific traumas. It depends on how much distance you want to get from your own culture and other cultures. You can take quite a big distance from these things and look over centuries, and you can be quite proud of something that's occurred, even though it involved all kinds of terrible mistakes, group-wise or individual-wise, to get there. I don't see why we should be resentful of other individuals and this kind of thing, and of just write off, you know, say white culture or black, any culture. Like, you don't write off a culture. You have preferences, and that's part of who you are as an individual too. That's the great irony. You make preferences, you make choices. So I'm kind of happy with that. This is getting on a bit. I've just looked, it's an hour already. I didn't expect it to be this long, but you get my point anyway. So just to summarize, read Confucius, Kongjia. You could even read him in Chinese or Korean or English. Be careful with the man. I don't think his books on good governance and on filial piety will stand up, and I don't think they do, in a sense that they are not the popular books, as I've already said, to have been translated. And just on a literary note, Pound was the great man to translate these things into the popular mindset, to translate, you know, the anthology of poetry and things like the Unwobbling Pivot, and other people have followed him. And also Arthur Waley, you know, British translator, translated Confucius as well. So just read with diligence, but be wary of that. I think I wouldn't be on an automatic pilot and just bow down to somebody who's older than me. And I think it's an inevitable result of any one given generation that they, in some sense, emancipate themselves from their parents' perspectives over time. That's only natural. Does that mean that there's not a thread, a residue of unchanging values, which would mean traditionalism? I think the two can go hand in hand. The best things last and the worst things go away. That seems to be the case when it comes to spiritual evolution. So any inheritance you've imbibed from your parents, you will carry forward with you regardless. But there's a lot of chaff that needs to be sieved, because nobody's perfect, and you've got to get rid of that, and you've got to forge your own identity. So read Confucius, read everything you can get your hands on in whatever language you want to focus on. I think Pound over-egged Confucius. I have the Library of America Poetry and Translations volume. I said to a friend of mine that I don't really deal with the Confucian anthology very much. It's the one section of that big book that I just don't dip into very often. And I think even in the cantos, it's not my bag, as it were. I'm glad that he did it, but I'm not gonna. I'm much more interested in the Taoism and the esoteric Taoism and other things, I think. That's just for me. Or the other thing that you need to be reminded of is that Confucius was not really, I don't want to get into class warfare here, but he was an aristocrat in a situation whereby he could give advice to certain individuals, and a lot of what he wrote was not really popularly verified either in his own lifetime or the centuries afterwards. That's a grand statement, but I think a lot of what he wrote doesn't hold up to posterity very well, and I've already mentioned the two books that I think do, so I'll leave it at that. I do recommend Ezra Pound very highly, obviously, but that's not the side of Pound that really gets me going. There are other things that he's writing about that do, and I'll probably go into those at some other time. I might even read some of Pound's more esoteric investigations, you know, in the cantos when I get hold of my copy again, or other things. And also, related to this video, I will make some more videos on my feelings about other Chinese philosophers, because I am very respectful of Mengjia, which is the Korean for Mencius, and Chungjia, which is the Korean for Chuangzi, I think is the Anglo-Chinese pronunciation, and there's only one popular book available, I think. No, there may be a few actually. No, there may be a few. Okay, but we'll get into that in other videos. I'll definitely do some readings of Chuang Tzu in English for another time. But anyway, beware of filial piety and enjoy your day. Bye bye.